Welcome to Management TV. Today we are with Michael Porter, the #1 authority in the world in strategy, a Harvard Business School professor, and a famous author who wrote a book almost 25 years ago on competitive advantage. Thank you, Michael, for being with us. How would you define strategy? What is strategy in very simple terms?
Well, in very simple terms, it's what's going to make a particular organization different and provide a competitive advantage. Basically, competition is destructive when companies are basically competing on the same thing. That forces competition to gravitate to price. Strategy is finding a different way to compete to create a different sort of value for the customer, which allows a company to prosper, to achieve superior profitability.
What is not strategy?
Simply implementing best practices, buying the latest machine, using the internet to communicate with your customers. There are lots of things that managers do that they have to do to actually keep making the company more productive and more efficient and to attain the kind of latest technology and knowledge about management. All those things are a necessity, but they're not strategy. Strategy is not about doing the same thing better. Strategy is about finding that different place for the organization to deliver value. But what makes it challenging is you have to do both of these things at the same time. You got to keep assimilating best practices, but at the same time having real clarity about what's going to make you different.
You wrote a book 25 years ago that has remained at the top of the list of the strategy books. What were the key messages in that book?
Well, I've written a number of books about strategy. I think my first really major book on strategy was a book called Competitive Advantage, and I think the really major message of that was really how to look at the industry in which you compete and how to think about what causes industry profitability and how, by understanding that, a company can improve its own position. In that book, I introduced the so-called 5 forces framework, that in any industry you've got to look at the power of the customer, the power of the supplier, the barriers to entry, the threat of substitute products, and the nature of the rivalry itself, and that those 5 forces collectively define really the profit potential of any business. And this was, I think, a breakthrough in the field, because really we had no systematic way of looking at industries. The next book was a book called Competitive Advantage, in which I really talked about how to look at a company's own position and introduce the concept of the value chain. Any company, when it competes, is simply conducting a lot of activities, marketing activities, procurement activities, service activities, and so forth. And the value chain provided a framework for understanding how a particular company was competing versus its competitors, and therefore sharpening the distinctions in terms of its position. I would also say that equally important to the first 2 books is an article called What is Strategy, which really tried to get at the fundamental distinction between strategy and operational improvement. So I think if I had to sort of highlight the major concepts that have made my work relatively enduring, it would be some of those ideas.
And after 30 years, what has changed? Is everything relevant, or have things evolved?
Well, I've always focused not on the specifics of how a particular industry operates or a particular company competes. I've always been looking at really the deep fundamental underpinnings of competition. So, of course, industries are very different today than they were 30 years ago. We're much more global, there's different technology, things move at different speed, but actually the same 5 forces still determine profitability. It's still the power of the customer, the power of the supplier. So I think in some sense everything has changed, but at least from my point of view, very little has changed, in the sense that the enduring fundamentals of industry structure and the value chain and the importance of price and cost in determining superior performance, the distinction between operational effectiveness and positioning. All those things are what I would say are really competitive fundamentals that are timeless. And then at any given moment in history, the weights, if you will, or the specifics are constantly evolving. So I wrote a paper called Strategy in the Internet, which was written during the height of the Internet bubble. I think it was published in 2001. And at that point, we thought that the Internet had made everything different. And what became clear is, of course, it hadn't changed anything. There were still, industry structure still mattered, and you still had to have a competitive advantage. And so, again, that's why. Now, there are other authors and other thinkers that really focus on helping us interpret and draw implications about a particular major development, like globalization or IT. But that's not the nature of the kind of work that I've tended to.
Some people would challenge the concept of industry. Yeah. If you take, for example, this device, what industry is it? Is it a phone? Is it a computer business? Or even a restaurant?
Yeah.
Is it in the food business, in the entertainment business? More and more, the boundaries of industries are less clear. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'd say that the boundaries of industries can certainly evolve and shift and change. I'm not sure that they're not clear. At any given point in time, by thinking about fundamental economics, we need to draw a set of boundaries at that moment. And so what we called a phone before is that industry definition is probably now a broader definition. Okay. Now, whenever we look at an industry and whenever we look at how companies compete, we've got to always be sensitive to where are the right boundaries and how are those boundaries evolving. What I have found, for whatever it's worth, is that industry boundaries change less and more slowly than some authors would have us believe. Okay. Some authors would have us believe that every business is constantly restructuring itself every day, and there are some, and they tend to be concentrated in the technology space. You pulled out a BlackBerry, and I think that's a little bit of a sort of a loaded example, if you will. That said, even in industries as mundane as distributing food, one can see boundary shifts. So I think that part of the discipline of strategy is actually coming up with a workable set of industry boundaries and starting to understand when those boundaries need adjustment.
And maybe just keep open to the definition of your product, because it's also true that we were talking with Don Tapscott about shirts that have more and more ecology in them, and so all of a sudden they're not just devices to wear or one or two colors, but a whole meaning, a whole belonging to a group, or things that drive price and value in a different way.
Yes, but I think that example you just raised is actually a bigger point. And that is that I am seeing more and more that the recognition is growing that what we once thought were social things and what we once thought were economic things are starting to merge together in some interesting new ways. Again, I've actually written a lot of articles about this, but for example, we once thought that environmentalism was a social issue. Now we think of environmentalism as actually an issue having to do with efficiency and use of resources. So all of a sudden it's become an economic issue. We used to think that environmental performance was costly. That is, to be a good environmental performer, you had to spend extra money. Now we understand that good environmental performance is probably low cost. So I think that that's an example of how as we get more sophisticated about the deep underpinnings of competition, we start to see another chapter. And I'm seeing more and more strategies that are effective embodying a social dimension.
Could you cite examples of companies doing that?
Well, I mean, it starts with the very common examples like Toyota. You know, Toyota has built a world-class reputation based on energy-saving vehicles and hybrids. And by the way, they've been at that for 20 or 30 years, and they were very early to perceive this opportunity. Probably because in Japan, the energy costs are extraordinarily high, so they were able to see that opportunity. One of the companies was Whole Foods, that is in the business of, it's a grocery store, but it's all about natural, fresh, locally grown, sustainable agriculture. They've really made that what they stand for. And that isn't attractive to every customer, but there's quite a few customers that really buy into a concept that's good for the environment and that's supporting the small family farm. So I think we're seeing more and more of those examples. You know, General Electric has finally understood that by thinking about the use of energy, they can really differentiate themselves. And I frankly think this is a very exhilarating trend, because I think that all of a sudden we're harnessing the power of the private sector and of sort of market forces to start to tackle some of these very, very challenging social issues. And you know, another thing I think it's important to add is the young generation, my children and the 20-year-olds and the 30-year-olds have grown up in a world where I think they are much more conscious to these issues. Therefore, I think the consumer response to strategies that embody these social dimensions is probably greater now than it would have been.
Yeah, we see, for example, Grameen Bank has made business success even through mechanisms that were not accepted by the banking industry or the financial industry. Do you think those examples will extend to other businesses?
I mean, I think they are. I mean, you know that the C.K. Prahalad's work and others has really emphasized that, you know, we've tended to design products and strategies really with the advanced, you know, Western economies in our mind. There's gigantic numbers of people with low incomes, with you know, they don't need to borrow $1,000, they need to borrow, you know, $100. So particularly in the developing world, I think you're seeing a tremendous explosion of new insights about strategic positions. And many of those insights actually have carryover value even to the advanced economies. Because there are segments of the market, even in the advanced economies, that will value these sort of bottom of the pyramid type strategies. So
you've worked on healthcare lately, and that is a subject that touches everyone from a personal point of view, but business also from a cost perspective. What is your vision on the future, on the next 10 years of healthcare, and where will it evolve?
Well, you know, I think first of all, the demographic changes are very, very scary for healthcare, because we know that older people just need more healthcare. And as we have new treatments and new therapies for more and more things, things that used to be just normally part of growing old are no longer accepted. And so people expect and should expect excellent care. We have more and more chronic conditions. Things that used to be fatal are now chronic. Cancer now is become, in many cases, a chronic condition, not a dreaded fatal disease. So all of that,
very expensive,
very expensive to sustain. So we have to find a way, I think, fundamentally, to move beyond the thinking about access. I think that traditional thinking about healthcare has been providing healthcare for all, providing good access to care, equitable care, and so forth. In our country, in the United States, that debate is about universal insurance. How can we get everybody insured so that people are not bankrupted by becoming sick? Now I think the access challenge remains, and we're still debating it in the United States, but I think increasingly the challenge is the delivery challenge. How can we actually deliver care effectively and efficiently? How can we actually improve the value of delivery? And I found as I worked in this field more and more over the last 6 or 7 years that this is not the way that people think about healthcare delivery. Healthcare delivery is stuck in a very old delivery paradigm. It looks very much like it did in 1950. You have hospitals and clinics and primary care, and it's a very fragmented system. It's a very local system. It's a system that's inpatient centric. That is, the center of the universe is the hospital, and the outpatient part is kind of on the side. We pay differently for outpatient and inpatient. We don't think of care in terms of the cycle of care for the disease. We organize around the doctor's specialty, not around the patient's needs. So I think there's a tremendous need and a tremendous opportunity to really transform the value of healthcare. So that currently is probably the single biggest focus of my time, not only in the United States, where of course we have the massive cost, but surprisingly in Sweden and Netherlands and Germany and all over the world, every country has started to recognize that we need to bring some fresh thinking to delivery. So that's what I've been focusing on.
What do you think about the new social networks, the Facebooks, the YouTubes? What are the implications of these phenomena?
You know, I'm probably too old to appreciate or understand these new phenomena. I can tell you that they really have changed the way that young people, you know, particularly younger people, relate and communicate with each other. And there's lots of related ideas like blogs and various other devices to communicate. And I think that application is undoubtedly going to at least persist for the foreseeable future. What is less clear is how those forms of communication are actually going to work their way into what I would call the mainstream economy. Yes. and mainstream business. Because I think that it's not clear how they connect in some very clear way to value creation or commerce, or what people will integrate into their work as opposed to their leisure time. So,
or even can you read their strategy, because they don't charge? I mean, it's hard to see how they will sustain.
Well, it's a little bit like the internet bubble. That is, you know, gee whiz, look at what we can do. Look at all the people that use it. But ultimately, if nobody's willing to pay, and there's not some kind of a way of really realizing the value, then ultimately you don't have a sustainable phenomena. You know, for every 100 internet companies, there were probably only 2 that survived, and that was because only those 2 were doing something that really could capture the value they were creating. So I think that the social networking and these kind of new forms of communication are a little bit of a bubble. I think email and texting is here to stay. I think that's just making communication more efficient and more effective. But I think these kind of blends between leisure and social, I think their impact on the real economy is probably going to be relatively limited.
You've worked with governments and private companies.
Yes.
What do they have to learn from each other?
I think governments tend to be focused on, on the public good and on meeting social needs. We must have governments. Somebody has to set the rules. Somebody has to be the referee. Somebody has to set the standards, or you can't have a functioning economy. I think what governments increasingly need to learn is they need to learn more about business, because increasingly the public policy, particularly towards the economy, is no longer just, you know, setting macroeconomic standards. It's getting very, very hard to create the environment for a successful economy, and traditional kinds of government policy, I think, are falling short. I think governments also need to learn more about strategy, particularly those parts of government that deliver services to the public, and increasingly we're starting to see governments set goals and objectives and define value and define strategies, and I think that's a welcome development. companies, as I was saying earlier, I think are starting to get the sense that there's a social dimension
Yes.
to what they do, and that they need to start viewing government not as the enemy, but as somebody they can collaborate with to actually create sort of these win-win opportunities for both economic value but also social value.
And that the social issues are not exclusively to be solved by
Absolutely.
the government,
In
but they
fact,
also have a role.
In fact, I think that we as a society are learning that many social issues cannot be solved by government and demand the collaboration of the private sector, including the NGO sector. But again, so in a sense, this is all very encouraging. I think this is a time in history where people can get depressed, about Iraq or about this or about that. But I think that we have risen to a new level, I think, of awareness of the importance of many social issues and the acceptance of social values. We've also moved to a new level of mobilizing the private sector and the market and other institutions to take on roles that government used to be the only one that could play. So I think that bodes well for kind of the general direction of society. But there's obviously new challenges every day, healthcare being one of the greatest ones.
Great closing remarks. Thank you very much, Michael, for being with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you for being with us.